Welcome to this video on biased sampling methods. By the end of this video, the student will be able to define population, sample, bias, census, and representative sample. The student will be able to identify two biased sampling methods and to recognize these two methods when they are described in examples. A population is the complete set of all measurements or data that are being considered. A sample is a proper subset of members selected from a population. Proper subset means the sample is smaller than the population. Why do we sample? Collecting data from every member of a population is called a census. Many times it is impossible or impractical to collect information from every member of a population. Instead, we collect data from a representative sample of the population and then make inferences about the population based on the information from the sample. The process of making inferences about a population based on a representative sample of the population is called inferential statistics. In order for a sample to represent a population, every member of the population must have an equal chance of being selected. A representative sample is a sample in which every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. If a sample is created in a way that does not give every member of the population an equal chance of being chosen, that sample is said to be biased. The characteristics of a biased sample cannot be generalized to the population as a whole. Biased sampling methods. This video explores two main sources of sampling bias: voluntary response sampling and convenience sampling. We will explore both of these methods in detail in the coming slides. Voluntary response sampling. A voluntary response sample is comprised of people who choose to participate in a survey. Often, these individuals have a strong interest in the topic of the survey. Because voluntary response sampling does not allow every member of the population an equal chance of being chosen, it is biased and thus does not generate a representative sample. Therefore, you cannot generalize the findings from a biased sample, or a voluntary response sample in this case, to the population as a whole. Unfortunately, almost all data collected from human beings involves some level of voluntary response, since people, unlike widgets coming off an assembly line or bacteria in a petri dish, have the freedom to not participate. Here's an example. To prepare for a presentation on self-care, Professor Lumen sends an email to her colleagues requesting information about their self-care habits. This is voluntary response sampling because Professor Lumen's colleagues must choose to respond to her email. Can you think of a way of collecting the data that Professor Lumen needs so that it is not a voluntary response? Convenient sampling. Subjects are selected because of their convenient accessibility and proximity to the researcher in either time or space. Since convenient sampling does not allow every member of the population an equal chance of being selected, convenient sampling does not create a representative sample. Since convenient sampling does not produce samples that are representative of the entire population, you cannot use this method of sampling to draw conclusions about the population you wish to study. Here's an example. A graduate student is looking for participants for a study she is conducting. She walks around her dorm and asks residents if they would like to participate on the following day. This is convenient sampling because she is surveying people to whom she has the easiest access. Notice this is also an example of voluntary response sampling because students must agree to participate in the study. Can you imagine a way of finding participants for the study that doesn't use either convenience or voluntary response sampling? Where is the bias? Let's consider the following example. Graduate-level researchers often ask undergraduate students attending their university or college to participate in studies they are conducting for their graduate research. Why is this procedure problematic? This is an example of convenient sampling. If the population researchers intend to study is all Americans, then undergraduate students are not a representative sample of this population. Undergraduate students typically represent a narrow age range and a specific socioeconomic status. For example, An 80-year-old person is unlikely to be represented in the sample. A homeless person is unlikely to be represented in the sample. No one in the US who is not attending their particular university has a chance of being selected, so again, this is not a representative sample of all Americans. Can you think of any other reason why this is problematic? This is also an example of voluntary response sampling. This procedure is also problematic because students must choose to participate in the study, which is voluntary response sampling. Oftentimes, a small stipend, which is money, will be offered to students participating in the survey. Since some students may find this a greater incentive than others, this creates additional bias in the survey. Let's look at this last example. It says, your boss asks you to conduct quality control on products coming off the assembly line. You want to make a 3 p.m. game of golf, so you go to the manufacturing site, grab the first 3 products off the assembly line to make sure they are being made correctly, and then leave. This is an example of convenience sampling. You chose to sample products that were closest physically and that were available at a certain time. This is not an example of voluntary response sampling, since the materials being surveyed did not have to choose to participate. Can you think of a better way to implement quality control on an assembly line? You should now be able to define the words population, sample, bias, census, and representative sample. You should also be able to identify 2 biased sampling methods and to recognize these 2 methods when they are described in examples.